è venuto a Verona, insomma ci onora della sua presenza, è una mia vecchia conoscenza, abbiamo un carissimo amico in comune, tra l'altro io e Stefan, quindi io sento parlare di Stefano oramai da una ventina d'anni circa. E,
Neanche solo una, neanche, non solo Luca, ma anche...
anche Irina, sì, un'altra
Irina.
amicizia successiva, sì, che proprio...
E Riccardo.
E anche, vabbè, Riccardo pure è venuto dopo, esatto. No, almeno tre amici in comune, esatto, sì, uno dei quali non c'è più purtroppo, Riccardo Dottori. E Stefan Sorgner è appunto un'autorità sul tema appunto del transumano, un'autorità internazionale. Ha pubblicato un'infinità di articoli, dirige una rivista molto importante, credo la rivista del settore. Sta scrivendo appunto, mi diceva prima, un libro sul transumano europeo, quindi distinto dal transumano di cui si sta parlando tanto in questi giorni negli Stati Uniti. Tutto il tema legato all'invecchiamento. Non so se avete sentito il discorso di Trump sull'invecchiamento. Io l'ho ascoltato ieri sera, 110 anni, 120 anni, 130 anni, 140 anni, cioè c'era tutto un discorso di Trump su questo tema che è proprio uno delle branche, insomma, dei temi del transumano. Quindi, insomma, temi molto, molto attuali, a differenza di tutti noi, insomma, i temi di cui parla Stefan. Però Stefan viene in realtà da un background nietzschiano, quindi ha fatto la tesi di dottorato, mi pare, no? Su Nietzsche. Ha pubblicato un testo sulla filosofia della musica nel mondo greco. E quindi è un'autorità anche per il tema di cui parlerà oggi, cioè di Adorno, del rapporto Nietzsche-Adorno, in relazione ad un tema specifico della musica del Novecento, un tema wagneriano, il Gesamtkunstwerk, no? Che appunto, quindi Stefan poi appunto coltiva appunto molto anche la sua passione per la musica, per l'opera, quindi è stato a Verona più volte ad ascoltare appunto varie stagioni operistiche, però non solo a Verona, mi dicevi Stefan che hai girato un po' per tutte le sedi Bayreuth, Puccini, insomma tutte le varie appunto sedi operistiche, quindi è un esperto, Stefan, anche di musica, oltre che di Wagner e oltre che di transumano, e oggi appunto ci parlerà di questi, insomma, di questi temi, credo nella loro connessione. Poi domani abbiamo un altro incontro qui a Verona, mi raccomando, chi di voi riesce a venire, domani dalle 12 alle 13:30 Stefan parlerà di intelligenza artificiale, da noi del Dipartimento al secondo piano del Palazzo di Lettere nella sala seminari, quindi siete tutti invitati. Laura sarà appunto keynote speaker insieme, sarà appunto respondent, scusate, lui è lo speaker è Stefan e anche Carlo, e poi appunto parlerà anche il nostro Badino domani. Quindi allora lascio la parola a Stefan su una relazione che terrà in inglese. Stefan appunto parlerà oggi in inglese, parla però anche italiano. Forse nella discussione possiamo anche intervenire in italiano, giusto? Giusto?
Sì, sì.
Anche in tedesco? Perché ci sono germanisti collegati, perciò
Anche in
dico,
tedesco.
e anche in tedesco ovviamente. Quindi il titolo era per oggi, aspetta, Adorno.
No, Adorno, io adesso...
Adorno, Nietzsche and the Gesamtkunstwerk. Benissimo, allora a te la libertà di improvvisare, Stefano, a te la parola.
Sull'ozio, un po' di più la rilevanza. E saluti da Maurizio Balistreri. Tu lo conoscete? È un caro amico mio anche con cui sto collaborando tanto. Sì.
Ecco qua. Forse riusciamo.
Sì, normalmente in questi giorni parlo spesso sul tutte le cose sono legate al transumanesimo, ma veramente gli elementi del transumanesimo hanno effetto su tutti gli altri aspetti del mondo culturale, non solo nell'etica applicata, ma anche nel settore culturale, nel campo delle opere, economia, politica. E oggi sì, sto un po' riflettendo sul Musikdrama, no? Music Drama, Gesamtkunstwerk all'inizio, così pensato sto qui, così forse considero anche un po' dell'antichità, così abbiamo tutti questi legami che ha già su quale ha già riflettuto tanto Nietzsche in particolare, e prova di collegare tutto anche ai nostri tempi. On leisure in particular. There's a constant struggle between people. A human is a wolf to another human, homo homini lupus. There's only one federal chancellor, only one chairman of the board of management at Daimler-Benz, and one founder of Facebook. But many would like to hold their positions. An apartment can only be rented once, and a vacancy can only be filled once. If a place on this train is occupied, we can only hope that another free and unreserved place is available. War is the originator of all things. We fight for money, recognition, and power. Sometimes it's all about survival. Sometimes it's about personally staying in history. In a world of constant struggle and change, to find time to reflect on the world, values, and beauty is an enormous privilege. It's primarily a useless activity. It is, however, intrinsically important. People value reflections on fundamental philosophical questions, since no one knows with certainty what holds the world together at its core, was die Welt im Innersten zusammenhält. It may well be the case that dealing with these reflections is helpful in the world of work. Primarily thinking about the world, values, beauty, leisure, a useless but intrinsically fulfilling activity. And I want to highlight again the relevance of leisure. We've forgotten about the importance of leisure. It's otium, no? It's this activity, what was called leisure in ancient times, or otium in Latin. It was always considered an enormous privilege. Only the best aristocrats had the financial or institutional power to devote themselves to leisure. To have time for leisure is an extraordinary privilege in a world of constant growth and the struggle of all against all. When we speak of leisure today, other activities are often identified with it. Most people, if you ask your students, it's a beer with colleagues, going bowling with friends, playing games on the Xbox or PlayStation. None of these activities is leisure in the original ancient Greek sense. Rather, these activities would have been considered a constitutive part of work by Aristotle. Those who work need to play, to relax. So the actual work, beer after work with colleagues, is still constitutive part of work. She who works needs rest, and work is an activity intended to earn money. Money, however, is only an instrumental good, as Aristotle already stressed. Money is useful because we can use it to invite our friends out, to pay doctors, to buy books. Slaves need rest. Aristocrats devote themselves to leisure. Recreation and leisure are categorically different from each other. People have to work because financial means are needed to survive. This assessment also applied to the ancient Greek aristocrats. They were ashamed to have to show to friends they too must work, if only to organize their own slaves. They wanted to be able to devote themselves to leisure, to demonstrate this in a social context, to have time and money, to be able to devote oneself to a useless but intrinsically valuable activity, which was accompanied by the highest social prestige. To have leisure is therefore not only a privilege, but also a way to demonstrate one's strengths, one's power. A person must be able to finance leisure. Nietzsche stressed this insight by giving an explicit description of the varying circumstances of the meaning of leisure in The Gay Science, Book 4, Aphorisms 3-9. How do schools and universities relate to leisure? What's the actual purpose of school time? What does the word school mean? Hardly anyone who goes to school is aware that skole, that it comes from school, from leisure. It's sort of just to make your students realize that what they're doing here, that is leisure. It's not playing, Xbox and the PlayStation. And most don't know that, have no awareness of that. And I think that really changes the attitude towards studying as well, or to the privilege of going to school, high school, university. No. The school comes from the ancient Greek word skole, which is the same meaning as the Latin otium. It means leisure. Schooling is a time when one has time to engage in activities that are fundamentally human but primarily useless. words, numbers, inferences. It's an enormous privilege to be able to go to school, a privilege which one must not take for granted. School and universities must be paid for. In Europe, this is usually done by taxpayers. In the United States, on the other hand, it's usually necessary to go to a private school or private university if you intend to pursue a socially exposed and well-paid job. The opportunity to end school, which is financed by taxpayers in Europe, it's a significant privilege for young people living in Europe. It enables, I don't understand why so many people, they just need to learn Italian, German, and here they can go to school for university for free. And the education is, as good as in American universities. It enables them to live aristocratically for a few years and to devote themselves primarily to leisure. Many of the skills learned are primarily of intrinsic relevance. At the same time, however, they can also be of instrumental use. Without having dealt with numbers, it's impossible to work as a tax advisor or to be able to make an income surplus calculation. Not to go to school means to disregard and squander a huge privilege financed by hard-earned taxpayers' money. Only when I've learned basic arithmetic can I become an expert in developing solutions for dealing with global warming, even though it deserves further consideration whether compulsory schooling, as we have it in Germany, is an appropriate legal approach, or whether compulsory education as it exists in the USA would be a better regulation. I cannot deal with this here, but it goes beyond the scope of this presentation. In school, we also promote intellectual engagement with music, another useless activity. Musicians produce sounds. Listeners go to concert halls just to listen to them. Humans are already a special kind of animal. We fight for money, status, and power. At the same time, we learn to use instruments to create useless sounds. It is an exciting undertaking to look at the meaning of music, the arts in general, and also the concept of beauty against the background of a naturalistic worldview, of one with a sort of the will to power ontology, maybe. No. The objective of aesthetic contemplation can no longer be contemplation of eternal and unchangeable truths, which has been the prevailing interpretation in the context of Western cultural context, of the dualistic structures of like the Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition. After Darwin, that has changed. We no longer share their traditions, no longer so widely upheld. So contemplation of musical sounds has to be understood against the background of the meaning of leisure. To process time and money, to possess time and money that enable one to make music is an enormous privilege, which is accompanied by a high social prestige. It's not to serve the purpose of making money. Within the framework of aesthetic contemplation, the possibility of leisure, of reflection on the fundamental questions about the world with which the arts deal with an essential mediating way arises, which happens in philosophies in an abstract intellectual way. The fact that the social dimensions of leisure must not be ignored is incidentally also striking in the context of the artes liberales, and reflections on music is one of the numerical arts. The liberal arts were not to refer to as such in order to reflect freely and associately on music, but because one had to be free from work in order to devote oneself to this useless activity. Here too, the close connection between leisure and social independence from the need to work becomes clear. Leisure cannot be conceptualized without a socially privileged special position. Someone has to pay for it, or it needs to be paid for. Because otherwise you need to focus on work, on just survival. The music mentioned in the context of the 7 liberal arts, which is one of the numerical arts of a quadrivium, the 4-way, is not about the activity of composition or music practice, but about reflection on music. This also has to do with the worldview prevailing at the time, according to which there was an analogy between numerical relations, virtues, and ontological ultimate justifications. However, we've said goodbye to this view at the latest with Darwin, Nietzsche, and Wagner. It's no longer sort of that numerical truths exist in some Platonic realm, and there's like a correspondence to virtues and some ultimate truths. So that has changed. So we can no longer have the same type of justification for leisure either. In order to be able to comprehend the musical oeuvre of the contemporary composer Sven Helbig in an appropriate manner, we must know, so I will also deal with contemporary composers, we must now devote ourselves to reflecting on his music, and in particular pays special attention to the concept of the total work of art. Only then we'll be able to enter into a relationship between Helbig's non-totalitarian total work of art and that of mindfulness. Both my reflections on Gesamtkunstwerk and mindfulness in the subsequent aesthetic intellectual examination of Helbig's work are leisure activities to which we can devote ourselves. Because nowadays, most people from developed countries are not forced to worry too much about making a living, which is an enormous privilege. Globally, we're all the 1%. Actually, what has changed? We are all aristocrats. I mean, what has changed? If you're like 200 years ago, the absolute poverty rate was more than 90% globally. Even that has gone down to 10%. But we are like, just to get an understanding of how privileged we all are. We are the aristocrats. Whether the possibility exists that all humans can become aristocrats and robots will become our slaves, or whether artificial intelligence will make us slaves is an open question. But let's concentrate on the question of the possibilities of contemporary meanings of total works of art. To understanding of opera as a total work of art has been decisively influenced by the artists, composers, and thinkers from German and Italian culture. Members of the Camerata Fiorentina invented the opera. Wagner and Nietzsche have significantly influenced musical history by pleading for a realization of the musical drama. In the 20th century, debate on the question of opera as a total work of art was continued in Germany by Thomas Mann, in Italy by D'Annunzio. These two cultures have much in common. These decisive reasons for focusing on opera is that both cultures have been in constant dialogue with Greek antiquity. The opera was born out of a misunderstanding of ancient tragedy, and the orientation toward the ideal of ancient drama played a central role in numerous proposals for reforming opera. However, this approach, which focuses on the music drama, also has significant social implications. A unified total work of art requires a communitarian community in which the values and symbols represented are shared. Herein lies the central problem that Adorno, Thomas Mann, and Popper explicitly address, and that's the problem of totalitarianism. So when everyone has to share in order to uphold you need to impose these values, because otherwise the great diversity arises. And that's whenever sort of a Gesamtkunstwerk, the functioning of it having an ethical, a cultural meaning in society presupposes a community. But a community, how can a community exist without these oppressive totalitarian structures? Therefore, the following challenges arise for the present. Does a total work of art necessarily have to have totalitarian implication? And in it, is it still permissible to aim for realizing a total work of art today? Or does it already lead to imply a type of fascist thinking? The contemporary German composer Sven Helbig is realizing a total work of art. Does this necessarily making a proponent of totalitarian ideologies? Or is there also the possibility of creating non-totalitarian total works of art? And this is our central question. With his perspective as Nietzsche is a central philosopher who's turning away from totalitarian ways of thinking, and therefore has influenced a lot of different movements from postmodern, critical posthumanism, and many different movements, realizing and highlighting that the need to undermine that any correspondence theory of truth can no longer be justified. The problem is Plato, Galileo, and Wagner. Plato can be regarded as the intellectual forefather of the musical drama, since the inventors of the opera, the members of the Camerata Fiorentina, intensely dealt with his reflections on the music drama. But here the problem already begins. Popper has convincingly shown that Plato is an advocate of a totalitarian political order. Plato's reflections on the ideal tragedy are part of his proposals for revising them. He banned Homer and Hesiod from his ideal city, and only allowed the performance of dramas that represent the idea of the good in terms of content, form, and material. Instead of being entertaining, music should promote the cardinal virtues. And this circumstance ultimately led to the invention of opera. Analogous thinking was, in fact, to be found among the members of the Florentine cultural workers in the middle of the 16th century. The musician thinkers and music theorists of the Camera Fiorentina were dissatisfied with the polyphonic music of their time, considering it morally corrupting, just stirring up the emotions. They wanted to create a musical drama inspired by the ancient tragedy, which could help to express the virtues. And this could only be done through the monodic thinking, since the kind of music, in their opinion, represented the essence of ancient music. In order to develop the musical drama in the best possible way, they studied Plato's philosophy of music, drama in particular. Girolamo May, an expert in ancient music and the philosophy of music, living in Rome, originally from Florence, helped Giovanni Bardi, the spiritus rector of the Camerata Fiorentina, and Vincenzo Galilei, a decisive head of the association, humanist, singer, and father of Galilei, to better understand Plato's philosophy by explaining in letters the question addressed to him, because he was the only one to know ancient Greek, and none of these were able to read the Plato's text in Greek, in particular, him being an expert in ancient music theory. One result of this exchange was a Dialogo della musica antica e della moderna by Vincenzo Galilei. Inspired by these ratings, as well as by the intellectual exchange within the Camerata, other members of this association, Jacopo Peri and Ottavio Rinuccini, created the first opera, the melodrama Daphne, which unfortunately no longer exists. The two artists were also responsible for Eurydice, the first melodrama still preserved, which was premiered on October the 6th, 1600 in the Palazzo Pitti in Florence during the wedding celebrations of Maria de' Medici and the King of France, Henry IV. Today, the assessment of ancient tragedy is no longer shared. It is rather assumed that the choral parts were sung primarily. And this is due to the fact that there are numerous papyrus findings with notations of the choral parts. The protagonist mostly had spoken parts. Only occasionally there were parts with other dimensions finds. For the speaking parts, the iambic trimeter was used. That means a spoken verse similar to colloquial speech. The choral parts, on the other hand, have the dimensions of choral lyricism and are constructed in the form of verses. So thus, the attempt to revive the ancient tragedy can also be called the invention of opera. Structurally, Richard Wagner's reflections on the Gesamtkunstwerk are not unlike those of the Camerata Fiorentina. He had ethical intentions or cultural intentions. Incidentally, Nietzsche already recognized the relevance of ethics in Wagner's work at a young age when he confessed the following in a letter to Erwin Rode, I quote, "What I like about Schopenhauer pleases me in Wagner. The ethical are the Faustian send, the cross, death, and tomb," unquote. The dramatic aspects of Wagner's music drama also have an ethical cultural significance in his works. He strove for a new form of dramatic unity. In doing so, he reacted to the separation of the arts, which he wanted to transform into a new unity. Bayreuth was to become the heart of the new community that was to represent an updated form of the ancient polis culture. He was by no means alone in this goal in the culture of the 18th and 19th centuries. For example, many thinkers needed to idealize a past pre-modern world, which was accompanied by a critique of contemporary culture. Novalis, in relation to the Middle Ages, Rousseau in relation to pre-cultural nature, or Winkelmann in relation to antiquity. It's always, oh, let's go. The current times are so rotten, we need to go back to some good old times in the past. Wagner notes that ancient drama was conservative, since the myth present in drama corresponded to the thinking and action of the national community, which, however, was no longer the case in his own time. At that time, there have been a separation of the arts and also of society, as had also happened in the Athenian state when, I quote Wagner, "common spirit split into 1,000 selfish directions," unquote, and dissolves the, quote, "great total work of art of tragedy into the individual artistic components included in it," unquote. Wagner, for his part, wished for a return to a community that had grown out of the people and hoped to be able to support the social movement directed towards this with the help of the musical drama. Wagner's theoretical reflections on music drama began with the dissatisfaction with contemporary opera and his orientation towards ancient thought, which enabled him to work out an ideal for an artistic view of art. He had the hope of being part of a cultural development that could overcome the particularism and nihilism of his time and make a new culture possible. Here it must be emphasized that Wagner did not assume that he himself could actively create a new culture with his work. In contrast to Nietzsche, it was clear to him that a culture could only arise from the people. So it has to be like a development as part of a cultural movement. I quote him, but it's precisely this bond, this religion of the future, that we unhappy people are not able to make, because we, as many as we may be of those who feel the urge for the artwork of the future within us, are only individuals lonely. The work of art is a religion that is vividly portrayed. Religions, however, are not invented by the artist, they only arise from the people, unquote. Wagner always emphasized the creativity of the people, or portrays the people as a true poet who would never think of singing a melody without words. The creativity of the people always finds its best phenomenon expression in myth. He says, in myth, the common poetry of the people grasps the phenomena only as a physical eye can see them, not as they really are in themselves. Since Wagner creates his dramas primarily for German rather than Greek culture, he draws on Germanic myths rather than others, because according to his theory, these are the ones that are appropriate for the German people. So that was the reason for choosing the Germanic myths rather than the Greek ones. Wagner's concern was not solely a reactionary one. So just as Plato and Galileo were not solely affirming reactionary objectives. In any case, Wagner understood there could not be a return to past ideals alone, but that these had to be born in consideration of a recent history of new ones in order to have an analogous effect. Nevertheless, the idea of a unity of human nature is strongly anchored in Wagner's thinking. Only under this condition can he assume that the new cultural and political order he advocates can be an appropriate one. Here it becomes explicitly clear that metaphysics, and with it Wagner's dogmatism, is associated with vehement violence, namely violence against the diversity of human physiologies, against which a totalitarian structured culture is taking action. And in this respect, Thomas Mann's well-known statement, there is certainly, I quote, a lot of Hitler in Wagner's wanting to talk alone, to want to have a say in everything, unquote, is certainly an accurate assessment. The reform proposals made by Plato, Galileo, and also Wagner presuppose a uniform human nature, which demands that certain human virtues are necessary for the good life. For them, the total work of art has an ethical concern that can only be realized in a communitarian community. However, such demands lead to a strongly paternalistic totalitarian society. But is it necessary that total works of art have these implications? Now coming to considering Nietzsche and the present. Plato, Galileo, Wagner wanted to reform the operas and promote the dramatic. Another composer who called for an opera revolution also advocated for the promotion of the dramatic, which can, of course, be understood primarily against the background of the opera seria at the time, and that was Gluck. However, Gluck was only concerned with an inner musical goal. So all of the others only considered music or music drama art as having an extra musical goal, something that's for the sake of ethics, for the sake of culture, for the sake of virtues. But Gluck actually asked for a reform of the dramatic with an inner musical goal. The dramatic unity of opera music, because in this way, he said, the language of the heart, the strong emotions, the gripping situation, and an ever-changing spectacle can be realized by the audience. So with Plato, the promotion of political order was at the art of opera. With Galileo, the promotion of virtue, and with Wagner, the promotion of a new culture. They all had a specific extra musical goal. They were interested in a holistic embedding of the musical drama in culture and life. Gluck's opera reform was therefore not concerned with the creation of total works of art, since opera's effect was not to extend beyond mere entertainment. So the inner unity was supposed to be there, and the dramatic unity, but for the sake of creating strong emotions and not to have an extra musical goal. And if this is the essence of total work of art, then the question does indeed arise as to whether total works of art can be conceived that do not call for the creation of a totalitarian ideology. Can we still have total works of art today? No. Are non-totalitarian total works of art possible? Or in principle at all? Can musical dramas aim at an extra musical effect without being embedded in a totalitarian ideology? Do we need, in order for resonance in a totalitarian work, do we need such a community of that everyone's believing shares the same religious views? Here Nietzsche enters the stage, as he realized that by inverting Platonism, truth gets abandoned too. By affirming naturalism, perspectivism becomes a philosophical necessity. There's a dialectical relationship between naturalism and perspectivism. Each one of these theories is being made plausible by the other one. And this move has significant implications for the philosophy of arts, which Wagner did not realize. Wagner had a naturalist understanding of the world, but he did not realize that thereby the correspondent theory of truth also needs to be abandoned. It's this realization which is being accommodated in Nietzsche's writing, in particular when it comes to the arts, as he suggests that aesthetics ought to be seen as applied physiology. Nietzsche's objections to Wagner's music are physiological ones, as he explicitly states himself in Nietzsche contra Wagner. Wagner's music drama affects Nietzsche's physiology such that it doesn't increase his strengths. This is Nietzsche's main reason for rejecting Wagner's musical creations. However, this approach has further implications for the question concerning the evaluation of total works of art, whether these necessarily have totalitarian implications. If Nietzsche's aesthetic twist is plausible, then one's own psychophysiological reactions to a work of art, as well as the reactions widely shared by others, are the ones that should be viewed as central for aesthetically evaluating artworks. Different people have different psychophysiological needs, affects, and desires. Consequently, each person needs to find the artworks that they need. They have like a bodily necessity to respond to. It should not be the case that one specific cultural organization is needed by all people. If this is the case, then it could be inferred that there can be non-totalitarian total works of art. It merely needs to be realized that a work of art is a suggestion, an option, an offer, but not the attempt of an ultimate solution to answer. So traditionally, all the attempts were, there was one answer of virtues, one answer of truth, one concept of what the culture should be like. But if we understand what is being suggested in the work as an opening of a dialogue, as a suggestion, rather than you all, that is the truth. That's sort of which goes along with what my teacher Vattimo says, with sort of the violence which goes along with the sacred, with the truth. Truth is extremely violent because it demands everyone to stick to it, rather than opening up as a dialogue. So that's why he was embracing the weak thinking. And I completely agree. If this is the case, then it could be inferred that there can be a non-totalitarian total works of art. It merely needs to be realized that a work of art is a suggestion, an option, an offer, but not the attempt of an ultimate solution or answer. And if this understanding, which gets realized by Sven Helbig's total works of art, in his music drama, which he composed for Weimar, From Lärm der Welt, on the noise of the world, in which the dangers related to embracing a utopia explicitly referred to. So far, the issue was not addressed whether Nietzsche's understanding of aesthetics as applied physiology implies an affirmation of overcoming nihilism by means of the realization of total works of music dramas or not. Arguments can be made which justify both readings of Nietzsche. I have argued elsewhere that Nietzsche stresses the need to overcome nihilism and wishes to promote the cultural movement in this direction by means of his own philosophical reflections. Nietzsche presents strong reasons in favor of this claim. However, I disagree with them. And so does the post-human paradigm shift. And that's also what Vattimo realized was nihilism is actually an achievement, something which needs to be embraced rather than what needs to be overcome, what most of the philosophers have suggested so far. Sven Helbig's musical pieces are non-totalitarian total works of art. He sees his works in the tradition of the total work of art. The way he treats topics and how his works are performed revealed that they're not meant as mere entertainment without at the same time but being paternalistic. Philosophically, musical oeuvre is shaped by post-human thinking. The post-human paradigm shift is decisively characterized by new relational and non-dualistic anthropology, which is also the central starting point for explaining why Gesamtkunstwerke are possible again after this event. The aim of post-human musical pieces is to convey a non-dualistic ontology of becoming. Non-dualistic thinking is weak thinking, since every worldview can only be understood as an interpretation. The concept of interpretation doesn't mean that the represented view is wrong, but only that it can be wrong. So it doesn't fall into the trap of the Cretan's liar's paradox. It is therefore not self-contradictory in the self of the Cretan's liar paradox, if that was applied to the idea. The truth of this epistemological basic attitude cannot be shown, but it should only be refuted by clarifying the validity of an ontological ultimate justification. Only if some God reveals itself and shows this is the truth, then we would have an ultimate, maybe we might have an ultimate truth criterion. And therefore, this perspectivism could be refuted. Since this hadn't yet been realized, this further strengthens the plausibility of weak thinking, of pensiero debole. Weak thinking is non-totalitarian, since each statement becomes an interpretation that cannot make the claim of ultimate validity for oneself. It is rather a matter of drafts, of proposals, of statements, of assessment. Helbig's total works of art are such suggestion. They do not claim to become the dominant works due to their being ultimately valid. The musical gestures his musical pieces embody do not lay claim to their own ultimate validity. Also, non-dualistic assessments are promoted, which are transported in these works in many ways. At the same time, it's clear that their ultimate justification is not a claim that can be made against the background. Here, the recipient is confronted with post-human musical creation in the form of the audience. The audience experiences post-human thinking, and at the same time can distance itself from it in order to reflect on it. It's a dialectical interplay between life-world experience and the distance that enables reflection, which the recipient experienced during the performance. So in contrast to the reform proposals made by Plato, Galileo, and Wagner, the aim is not to realize a new unified community, and Adorno has clearly highlighted the dangers which go along with it. Helbig's total works of art made proposals that promote a certain interpretation in a self-relativizing way, but do not impose on anyone. Whether his suggestions are appropriate ones remain uncertain. Proposals are being advertised. The performance makes it possible to confront this new paradigm and encourages the discussion of extra musical concern. And the intention of this musical work is not only entertainment, but rather leisure in the ancient sense, otium, scholae, in which the context principles are not conveyed dogmatically, but options are reflected on and experienced discursively. Herein lies a stimulating aspect of these post-human total works of art. Non-totalitarian total works of art are therefore not only possible, but even meet the requirements of post-human thinking. It becomes particularly exciting when we look at individual implications of this relational ontology of becoming, which are conveyed by means of analogies in Helbig's total works of art. And this way of thinking has a long history from Heraclitus to Nietzsche. Up until post-human thinking of our times. We are no longer concerned with knowledge for the sake of having it. Thinking and acting no longer represent a categorically separated duality. Even the apparent small, insignificant, everyday things become relevant. Where we live, what the climatic conditions are in the places where we are, what we eat now becomes philosophically relevant. All the questions that Nietzsche had already pointed out and highlighted. Everything is constantly changing in every respect, and everything is connected with everything else, with each entity being nothing more than the sum of its effects and others, resulting in the dissolution of the essence of each unity. The constant becoming becomes the new being. These insights enable us to reconceptualize the world around us, but these new beings are contingent noble points which dissolve again. Cows and pigs are kept in the smallest space on factory farms. Pigs are social beings and suffer enormously under these circumstances. Their excrement and urine affect the local groundwater. To prevent pigs from falling ill with the bacteria present in the shed, they are given antibiotics almost permanently. Industrial cattle farming intensifies the greenhouse effect and the associated global warming. Many people who have once seen a slaughter of pigs and cows either directly or in a video become vegetarians, at least for a short time. High consumption levels of red meat probably increase the likelihood of it developing colon cancer in humans. When we realize that we as relational beings are fully part of nature and only gradually different from all other purely natural entities, then the question arises how we should deal with them. Which moral status should be attributed to pigs and cows? The intellectual as well as emotional insight of being comprehensively embodied in the multitude of relational interactions brings mindfulness with it. We pay attention to what we eat, how we eat, where we eat, with whom we eat, where our food comes from and how it is produced. We also become aware of the social and environmental implications of eating meat. The richer a nation becomes, the more people are interested in eating meat because they now afford it. Meat consumption is also associated with social prestige. I can afford to eat veal fillet. It's a sign of strength, of power. Many people feel good about experiencing, representing, and affirming their social status in this way. The richer countries like China becomes, and the economic rise of China is probably unstoppable, the more people will want to eat meat, live in warm, beautiful houses, own cars, and want to travel. Hundreds of new airports are currently under construction in China. In percentage terms, private transport produces an enormous quantity of climate-changing gases. Helbig's total work of art presented a relational ontology of permanent becoming as a suggestion. In the leisure time of aesthetic contemplation, we experience it and reflect upon it on all of these implications. Here, it's not a matter of analyzing how many angels fit on the head of a pin, but rather of quite everyday concern of a widespread way of life. So by being confronted with these total works of art, we reflect upon our nutrition, our handling of raw materials, our leisure activities, our clothing. Aesthetically supported mindfulness meditations are mindfulness considerations about nutrition, clothing, and lifestyle. And there's no categorically separated duality between thinking and acting. Relational and non-dualistic thinking promotes the embedding of thought and action. Aesthetic contemplation is not separated from action, but refers to it. And this is a paradigm shift. And I don't go to the concert just to enjoy beautiful forms or to suffer from disharmonies, but there's a close relationship between attending a concert and my own way of life by having leisure time to reflect on these fundamental issues. Relational mindfulness is relevant for all areas of life. The relational ontology of constant becoming experience as a suggestion, but not imposed. So it's a matter into discourse, and it's made as a suggestion, and you can accept or reject, but at least you get the chance to relate to it, to reflect upon it, to think about it. And this is what makes Helbig's non-totalitarian total work of art so special. At this time, it becomes clear that the new revelation of leisure cannot represent a return to the ancient Aristotelian aristocratic ethics. According to ancient context, leisure was an intrinsic relevance since Aristotle assumed the possibility of knowledge in correspondence with the world. After the post-human paradigm shift, this basic attitude is no longer plausible. Instead, perspectivism now represents a plausible epistemological assessment. It is convincing that leisure alone is of intrinsic importance, and if every philosophical judgment is an interpretation and the existence of categorical dualities is convincingly doubted, is it then convincing that leisure can be of intrinsic importance? Would not the sole focus on the vita contemplativa then be a performative self-contradiction? Why should you reflect on the truth if, the Platonic realm of truth is no longer plausible? In order to revise one's own prejudices, a vita contemplativa requires the vita activa, through which the plausibility of philosophical judgments can be questioned, which leads to the necessity of further consideration. The vita contemplativa needs the vita activa, which in turn provides decisive impulses for further reaching vita contemplativa. It's sort of that hermeneutic circle in which we're embedded, rather than a contemplation of ultimate truth, which used to be sort of the central feature of leisure. And this has significant implications for the re-evaluation of leisure. With the expansion of the norm of equality and with the dignity of personal status of all people in modernity, a flattening of social hierarchies has come about. The aristocrat whose life is dedicated to leisure no longer plays an exposed role in society in this period. All people have gained dignity due to their humanity. Nobody has had so much that they no longer had to work. Work and dignity were linked. Leisure as a useless activity no longer played a central role in society. Work makes us useful members of a society. However, work is only a means to earn money, where money itself is only a means and not an end in itself. Work turns people into quasi-slaves. In the post-human world, however, such categorical dualities are dissolved. Master-slave, otium labor, different processes happen at the same time. More and more people are now becoming aristocrats. Absolute poverty 200 years ago was 90% worldwide and 80% in Britain still, even in developed countries. In the meantime, it has fallen to almost 10% worldwide. Through automation and digitalization, more and more people are becoming aristocrats. And this is accompanied by the possibility of changing the meaning of leisure, whereby leisure is in fact the activity of intellectually or essentially dealing with the fundamental philosophical challenges. If this movement were to occur alone, this re-evaluation would only be a return to antiquity, but this is not so. The cultural currents are also accompanied by a close connection between vita contemplativa and vita activa. Without action, thinking is not possible, which in turn suggests that one's own consideration should be put into practice, which also suggests the solution of the otium labor dichotomy. Without the plausible possibility of a judgment which is based upon an ultimate foundation, the sole focus of the vita contemplativa cannot be justified convincingly. So the post-human paradigm shift initialized by people like Darwin and Nietzsche in particular is thus indeed accompanied by an upgrading of leisure as intellectual and sensual reflections on philosophical challenges. On the other hand, a non-dualistic practice leisure is a constant dialectic between otium, labor, vita activa, vita contemplativa. It's this analysis, is this analysis implausible, since two seemingly contradictory concepts of leisure are both being affirmed? Against the background of non-dualistic thinking, the circumstance is rather given due to a linguistic problem. Our grammar forces us to make a decision between these two possibilities of meaning, since A and not A cannot be true. However, this impossibility represents a linguistic compulsion and not necessarily a plausible description of our circumstances. For this reason, even a post-human re-evaluation of leisure is not simply a return to the ancient ideal, but a complex twisting of different processes, twisting in the sense of eine Verwindung, Heidegger, Wahrnehmung. So it's not an overcoming where something is being left behind, but things are getting united, twisted in a new manner, in which the ancient high estimation represent one facet, which however must not be complemented by a non-dualistic concept. It's a twist of vita activa and vita contemplativa, which clearly gets demonstrated in Helbet's music drama On the Noise of the World, in which the plot consists of an alteration of abstract philosophical and theological reflection and practical events in the life world. So all coming to my conclusion. In a constant exchange with the ideal of ancient drama, thinkers, artists, and composers of German and Italian culture in particular have repeatedly put forward new proposals for reforming opera, in which the promotion of a dramatic unity has played a central role. The invention of the opera by members of the Camerata Fiorentina, Wagner's conceptualization of the total work of art have played a central role in this process. From today's point of view, their proposals represent dangerous pleas, then they are used to promote totalitarian structures. Is this circumstance rooted in the fundamental structure of all total works of art? By reflecting upon Nietzsche's suggestions of aesthetics as applied physiology, by considering Adorno's criticism, and by outlining central considerations concerning Sven Helbig's total work of art, it becomes clear that non-totalitarian total works of art are possible. Post-human thinking, and this represents Helbig's intellectual home, is non-totalitarian. It creates non-totalitarian total works of art which are at home in a post-human philosophy and are therefore to be assessed against the background of weak thinking, pensiero debole. The paradigm shift brought about by the paradigm associated with post-human thought is so fundamental that we cannot even begin to estimate the multitude of implications. After all, it is accompanied by the dissolution of the dualistic ontological basis of Western humanistic culture. In Richard Wagner's work, too, numerous approaches to post-human thought are already present. The God of the Ring, for example, the gods of the ring can be interpreted as transhumanist post-humans. And the use of language in Wagner's musical drama as an effort to move away from the ontologically, categorically dualistic concepts. For example, I mean, why do the gods in the Ring drama, why do they stay young and strong? Because they're dependent on Freya's golden apples. I mean, that's an enhancement technology. And the use of Wagner's words was very strange for the night. No one used the words like him. So we can see also the use of words as a way to attempt, like Heidegger, to move away from the connotations which go along with traditional words which have a binary implications. So these approaches could be of enormous importance in reinterpreting the relevance of Wagner's works of art. The intellectual and sensual examination of Sven Helbig's metaformances is particularly exciting and relevant for the present. His musical pieces are not performances, but rather metaformances, as a dualistic separation between artist and audience is removed. All participants leave the event after having been transformed by the metaformance of Helbig's total work of art, which represent a confrontation with sensually mediated philosophical proposals. But the proposals are always just meant to be as suggestions, as an opening for dialogue, and not as a final answer, a dogmatic answer to all the big problems. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Stefan, for this enlightening talk and very interesting connection between Nietzsche and a lot of different other authors and subjects, I would say. And also, I think this perspectivism thing will occupy us in the discussion. Allora, apro la discussione in italiano e appunto ringrazio Stefan, dicevo appunto trovo appunto molto utile per noi questo nesso prospettivismo nietzschiano, Gesamtkunstwerk, no? Che appunto sarebbe appunto una sorta di modo, no? Di interpretare Gesamtkunstwerk in maniera non totalitaria, se ho capito bene. E forse posso avviare io magari la discussione perché ho un paio di cose che mi piacerebbe appunto chiederti, Stefan, e cioè la prima è questa. Il prospettivismo, ovviamente, tu l'hai messo in rapporto con Wagner, no? Cioè con un modo di guardare a Wagner appunto non totalitario, no? Cioè il tema chiaramente fa pensare molto alla polemica anche Nietzsche-Wagner, no? E quindi, però, appunto, in genere la polemica Nietzsche-Wagner non viene vista da questo punto di vista, no? Cioè la polemica Nietzsche-Wagner viene vista appunto in altro modo, no? Wagner che avrebbe tradito, no? Lo spirito dionisiaco, no? C'è tutto un altro modo di guardare alla questione. Quindi volevo chiederti, prima domanda, se il dissidio Nietzsche-Wagner potrebbe avere alle spalle questo tema, che sarebbe un tema di carattere anche politico, no? Cioè un Nietzsche paradossalmente più progressista, sicuramente meno radicale, meno romantico forse di Wagner, e quindi in grado di guardare appunto oltre, no? Wagner e di essere più avanti di lui, e quindi questo potrebbe essere un altro modo di guardare al dissidio Nietzsche-Wagner, punto interrogativo. Questa è una domanda che riguarda Nietzsche. Per quanto riguarda invece il tuo percorso che arriva fino a Helbig, che parte da Platone e che attraversa la Camerata Fiorentina, Camerata dei Bardi, la nascita dell'opera, la storia dell'opera, mi veniva in mente che in Platone, ovviamente, Gesamtkunstwerk sarebbe alla fine del simposio, quando Platone dice Socrate dice, Platone fa dire a Socrate, la mia in qualche modo è la migliore tragedia e la migliore commedia. Quello è un Gesamtkunstwerk, no? Sarebbe quello il Gesamtkunstwerk platonico, no? Che poi dopo diventa affermazione successivamente della teoria delle idee, quindi di verità forti, unilaterali, no? Però forse questo è quello che potrebbe, no? Tu volevi dire. Prima domanda. Secondo, quando tu dicevi il rapporto tra vita attiva e vita contemplativa, no? Ovviamente a me viene da pensare, se poi ti do io da scrivere la penna, a me viene da pensare, oltre a tutti i parallelismi che tu hai fatto, ad un altro nome che forse potrebbe essere utile, che adesso ovviamente arricchirebbe questo percorso, che è Giambattista Vico, il quale parla del nesso verum factum, no? Cioè vero è tutto ciò che io posso fare, no? La verità è data dal fare, no? E cioè dall'azione, no? Dalla possibilità pratica di agire e di costruire la stessa nozione di verità, no? Vero è solo ciò che posso costruire, non esiste una verità separatamente dal fare, no? E quindi mi domandavo se Giambattista Vico non potrebbe essere un ulteriore anello nella tua ricostruzione. Benissimo, adesso però mi taccio e magari vediamo anche se da casa.
Ultimo punto ancora su Vico, perché...
Giambattista Vico parla della coincidenza tra verum e factum. È uno dei celebri, diciamo, delle celebri tesi di Vico. Che cosa vuol dire questa coincidenza? Che vero è solo ciò che io posso fare. Non esiste una verità separata dall'agire, no? E questo va, credo, nella direzione di quello che dicevi tu, vita attiva e vita contemplativa, no? Questo nesso, no? Secondo me è già presente in Giambattista Vico in maniera molto forte, è una delle tesi più radicali, più importanti forse insomma, di Giambattista. Beh, però adesso mi taccio e magari, insomma, ti lascio la parola e poi magari da casa o anche da...
Il punto, grazie Alessandro. Il primo punto, no, questo parlando, sì, il rapporto Wagner-Nietzsche, il conflitto, non è stato legato rispetto alla verità, ma veramente si potrebbe interpretarlo, sarebbe ancora più forte o più interessante in un modo filosofico, legale, no? Sì, assolutamente, perché in questo settore Nietzsche era molto legato al XX secolo, al futuro, ma Wagner il concetto è più legato a qualcosa più dogmatico, più tradizionale, la verità non cambia, no? Qualcosa così. Ma anche se lui ha stimato molto Darwin, per esempio, per istruire il suo figlio Siegfried, no? Nel diario di Cosima c'è scritto, per esempio, no? Lui dovete insegnare Darwin a Siegfried, perché questo è veramente il migliore modo di essere concettuale, usare le scienze naturali. Nel senso c'è il modo evoluzionario dinamico in Wagner, ma per le cose che lui afferma, nel senso deve essere una nuova cultura che viene creato, che viene in esistenza, ma che cresce dalla cultura, dalla gente, no? Che non è creato da un individuo e da un genio, ma crea dalla gente e c'è ancora questo elemento sì, di qualche verità, di qualcosa in comune che tutti devono affermare. Il prospettivismo in Wagner non si trova. No? Sì, il conflitto fra Wagner e Nietzsche storicamente è stato qualcos'altro. Non si sa esattamente. Almeno si potrebbe, no, questo è più interessante, ma nel senso storicamente non è completamente chiaro che è successo. C'è sempre, tanti dicono, no, c'è questa una große Beleidigung, una grande offesa che è successo fra di noi, che ha aggredito Nietzsche. E non si sa esattamente, probabilmente è successo perché Wagner ha consigliato un medico a Francoforte a Nietzsche, Nietzsche ha parlato qualcosa sulla masturbazione, probabilmente ha detto Wagner, e Wagner ha detto a tutta la gente a Bayreuth hanno parlato sulla masturbazione di Nietzsche, probabilmente non è troppo, non è stato, lui non è troppo contento su di questo, probabilmente l'ultima persona che l'ha sentito. Va bene, così probabilmente il motivo legato al conflitto è stato qualcosa più biografico, ma avrebbe dovuto essere qualcosa, anche Nietzsche avrebbe potuto prendere veramente l'elemento della verità, che secondo me è una delle... No, Nietzsche è grande, ma il prospettivismo è veramente, con il prospettivismo è veramente creato tutta la filosofia continentale del XX secolo. Sì, e Platone, in Platone io ho fatto riferimento in particolare alla Politeia, alla riflessione dove no, ci sono buttato fuori tutte Homer Hesiod, invece no, l'arte, la musica dice ma musica e non è musica, è come un modo di rifare riferimento probabilmente a arte più generale. Deve essere, tutto deve essere in corrispondenza con il concetto del bene,
Sì, però
ultima
diciamo,
verità.
c'è il tema di tragedia e commedia che vengono a confluire in un unico nuovo genere,
Sì,
che è il dialogo,
sì,
il dialogo socratico.
sì, no, questo ha ragione, sì.
Quindi dice proprio l'idea di una nuova forma
Sì.
d'arte che abbraccia tutte le arti
Sì.
precedenti, no? Quindi qualcosa che potrebbe andare nella direzione di Gesamtkunstwerk.
È veramente, no, fa parte un altro modo di concepire il Gesamtkunstwerk, sì. Sì, sì.
Per pubblico c'è la censura della poesia
Sì,
tradizionale,
sì,
ma la
grazie.
censura della poesia tradizionale poi ha un aspetto propositivo che è quello appunto di fondere tutto quanto in questo nuovo genere del dialogo socratico, no?
Sì.
Che contiene per esempio una nuova mitologia, no? Platone vita nuovi miti, quindi c'è un'idea, no, di creare una nuova forma d'arte, no? Platone è molto evidente.
C'è la musica, ma non si canta i dialoghi, no? Si dovrebbe forse anche cantare. Sì, no?
Perlomeno hanno una struttura
Sì.
ritmica, no? Alcune parti dei dialoghi di Platone.
Forse così pensi, no? Anche Platone forse ha pensato ai propri dialoghi di essere usato come instrumento.
Forse, sì, questo
No. Sì, no, interessante, no? Interessante, sì. Sì, con il secondo commento su Vico, no? Devo esplorare e trovo molto, molto affascinante. Non sono sicuro qual è il concetto del verum che Vico ha. È così, a questo punto...
Nelle distanze, no?
Sì, è solo nel senso la struttura che è molto, c'è un'analogia strutturale fra le cose che ho descritto, ma solo il concetto del verum è qualcosa più essenziale in Vico probabilmente, che non viene, no? Qualcosa di non cambia.
Beh, no, cambia perché coincide con ciò che si fa, no? Quindi coincide con la capacità produttiva poetica dell'uomo, no?
Ma poetica esiste solo nella costruzione e quando viene costruito un'opera d'arte, o anche c'è qualcosa che non si può descrivere che esiste senza, nel senso in modo teologia negativa, qualcosa non si esiste ma non si può descrivere, ma nella costruzione si può rivelare forse alcuni elementi. E questo, no?
Non è trascendente questa
Sì.
verità.
No, è molto, molto interessante e affascinante. Forse ci sono le collegamenti, sì. Grazie.
Qualcun altro vuole intervenire?
Ma allora, se mi
No.
sentite, mi
No, aspetta.
sentite?
Io non ti sento però, cara.
E aspetta che apro.
Non ti sento.
Mi sentite?
Non riesco a sentire assolutamente nulla. Dipende
Questo
da noi?
Sì.
Vediamo un po'.
Direi di sì. La scrivo, va bene,
Non ho idea.
intanto magari la scrivo. Vediamo se riuscite.
Prova un po', Carlo.
Ecco, eccomi. Mi sentite?
Ora dovrebbe essere il volume in più è aumentato, però non è un problema di volume.
Di solito
Ci
funziona.
sentiamo.
Ok, infatti Francesco mi dice che mi sente benissimo.
Vuoi provare a scrivere, Carlo?
Sì,
Una domanda perché io invece
va
non
bene, va
Funziona
bene.
con
Allora,
altri che si può sentire altri?
No,
sì,
loro tra di loro si sentono, siamo noi
intanto
che non li sentiamo.
Ah, allora sì, ok.
Quindi
aspetta che ti scrivo in chat.
loro tra di loro si
Secondo
sentono.
me che qua dobbiamo mettere...
Quindi è poi un altro
Prova un po', Carlo. Prova a parlare.
Mi
Sì,
sentite?
è riuscita, Laura. Laura è riuscita, grazie.
Perfetto.
Sì, sì, vai.
Facciamo prima. Should I speak in English? Should I speak Italian? How would you prefer, Stefan? First of all, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, yes.
We will make presentations in person tomorrow morning. Um, and you can hear the reason why I have done today. So I prefer to speak in English. I will speak slowly, so also the other people that are connected may. I don't want to stress our guest speaking too much in Italian. First, I would say that your notion of metaphysical truth, I personally have many objections against this idea of metaphysics that was invented by Nietzsche and also by Heidegger. And it is a sort of received wisdom in contemporary philosophy, where, frankly, I don't think that Greek philosophers were truly assessing the existence of a monolithic, absolute, totalitarian, indeed, sort of truth. This is typically modern, I would say. This is typically modern from Descartes on, and ending with Hegel, of course. You know, it is true, I would say, that your way of presenting the history of metaphysics presupposes an univocal idea of being, which has been clearly rejected by Plato, by Aristotle. So if you're saying that ancient and medieval philosophy defended the notion of transcendence, we agree. But that notion of truth is definitely not univocal. They do not defend universality of beings, which was defended by Parmenides, probably the only one that can be directly accused of what you say is Parmenides, not Plato, and especially not Aristotle. I mean, the idea of the analogy of being, actually, and this is also true of most part of medieval philosophy, what of course they affirmed the existence of an eternal and necessary being. But it was not the key point. The key point of their philosophy was assessing their relation between the eternal beings and all the other beings. So it was an idea of multiplicity, plurivocity, plurality, okay, and also a relational notion of being. I agree with you. Of course, they presuppose an idea of transcendence, but they evoked this idea of a transcendent being in order to explain, right, the natural phenomena. So it was much more a proto-scientific notion rather than a truly philosophical notion, because the true philosophical gist of ancient and medieval philosophy was precisely this notion of super strong relation okay, between beings, no matter if they were eternal or not. But anyway, so this is something we should not forget, right? I would say that the true enemy is really modern philosophy, because modern philosophy is really totalitarian. Is really totalitarian because it really states that there is a truth and you have to stick with it. And if you consider ethics, okay, you can see the flexibility of ancient and medieval ethics with the incredible stiffness of modern ethics. Kant, you have to stick, you know, to the to the categorical imperative. You have to stick with it, otherwise, you know, shame on you. So I would say that the true enemy is really, and also, I mean, if you consider, but just think of Foucault. I mean, you know, the disciplinary society, hospitals, whatever, you know, it is basically a modern invention, okay? Much more than just think of the man-nature relationship that ancient Greeks said. Even in the times of Plato and Aristotle, we can agree with Nietzsche. Maybe it was already a decadent relationship, but still that relationship existed and was very strong. About what you say, it puzzles me when you say that Nietzsche is more progressive than Wagner. Especially because, you know, Nietzsche clearly states that the audience, there must be a clear distinction, I would say even a division, a separation between the artwork and the audience. Because the real problem with modern, sorry for the cat, the real problem with modern philosophy, especially with Kant, Nietzsche criticizes Kant's aesthetics precisely because he says that Kant put the audience within the artwork. And this is anathema to Nietzsche. I don't think that Nietzsche would really, or not at all, agree with what you proposed. Finally, third question, I would say that I personally consider also weak thought totalitarian and very violent indeed. Not really totalitarian, but very violent. Because not because I defend a notion of truth to which we must all abide, okay, and to which we must all stick, but because if only interpretation exists, then there is only the conflict of interpretations. And this conflict, how can you prevent this conflict to become violent? How can you prevent this conflict to become a conflict where only the most violent and the strongest actually wins? Of course, when Nietzsche speaks about the conflict of interpretation, he has in his mind an agonal notion of it. He has in mind the Greek notion of agon, so let's free the conflict of interpretation, but he has a very aristocratic, very fair play also idea of conflict in his mind, because we are all aristocrats, right? Because only an aristocrat has the right, actually, you know, to make an interpretation, a Weltanschauung. So since we are all aristocrats, you know, we prevent this danger of violence. Okay, it is always a fair contest. But I don't think that is really, and if we look at what is happening in the world right now, okay, you know, we see that there is no such thing as an agonal conflict of interpretation is going on.
Yeah, thanks. Three great points. Let's start with the last one. So violence, yes, there is violence in weak thinking, of course. But I don't, sort of the last point you made, so, there is violence in today's conflicts, but sort of the violence which arises out of like the conflicts we're currently facing, this is like people like in Russia, Dugin and Trump and Bolsonaro, they share, many of them have advisors who have a strong notion of enlightenment is evil. We need to return to an essentialist truth, to something eternal values, and they do share that, and it's clearly highlighted, and it's still, and that also, and they do share essentialist notions, Trump's notions concerning sex, only two binary sexuality exists. There's also an essentialism which comes up there. There's loads of essentialism which actually lead to all the violence in the conflicts. However, I'm not even denying that there's no violence in any kind of, even if you're making a suggestion. There's a bit of violence if you're making an advertisement, if you show something, but there's less violence. But and in particular, there shouldn't be the violence, in particular, if one realizes it with the perspectivism, with weak thinking, that all of your statements are interpretations. Interpretations can be false. And that not only, that means your statement might be false, but it also means your statement might be true, and my statement might be false. So I'm opening that mind, that demands. So having that perspective demands a very humble attitude, a very modest attitude concerning one's own self-understanding, and acknowledging I might be completely wrong with everything I said, and you might be right. So let's discuss. So let's have that openness to the other and enter into a discussion. And even if in any kind of discussion there are violent elements because of power difference and some other circumstances and rhetorical devices which can occur, but just by taking that self-relativizing stance reduces the violence significantly in comparison to the violence which goes along with holiness, sanctity, essentialist truth conceptions. So I'm not denying that there's no violence in weak thinking, but the violence ought to be much lower, less significant, and it's as low as you can get it. So it's a way to avoid violence, at least. With respect to Wagner and sort of being the innovative thinker, innovation and Nietzsche, well, there are innovative elements in Wagner as well. And I do, it's not only Nietzsche, and there's some very, if we look at Nietzsche's political outlook, and where basically it's critical of liberal democracies, and what he aims for is like a Sipa Mayor, the sort of the passages where really armed for a very hierarchical communitarian society, maybe with slaves. It's not, he didn't spell it out in too much detail, but it's clearly not the liberal democracies which we cherish, most of us cherish today. And that is sort of very much, there's a lot of tension which we wouldn't see as a very postmodern contemporary, something praiseworthy in Nietzsche. And then there's in Wagner, clearly, if I think about the prelude to Tristan and Isolde, musically speaking, so even if like concerning philosophical, ethical ideals in Wagner, I mean, he has binary thinking, he has truth concepts which he affirms, but musically is extremely avant-garde. Basically, you can still analyze the prelude in Tristan and Isolde, musical on the basis of tonal function. So it's a double dominant reduced, but so it's still analyzed in functional terms. However, it is really at the edge of tonality. It is really one step further and leads to 12-tone music of Schoenberg. So there's a lot of forward-looking elements in Wagner as well. So it's not so simple-minded. And it good that you highlighted that. So it's not simple-minded binaries that sort of only Nietzsche was like avant-garde and Wagner was not, and they're conservative and backward-looking elements in both of them too. Yes, concerning the first point, I don't think it is important what Plato meant and what Aristotle meant. I think it is important what the reception of Plato's and Aristotle's thinking was by means of Christianity, and what the consequences it had in culture. So that's why, and the consequences it had in culture, it actually leads to discriminatory, violent thinking. It leads to discriminations. And I think sort of by reference to Plato, all the problematic, whether he meant it or not, it's sort of the cultural traces which you can analyze. And sort of if you just make a reference to Plato's, no matter how he understood it, and there are obviously millions, there's so many different ways of understanding it, but and why he uses dialogue and how his unwritten the letter is supposed to be interpreted and what's original, what's not. But that's not, I don't think that's important. The important stuff is how it's being received in culture. And here we see, you just need to make the reference to Plato's allegory of the cave, and in the allegory of the cave, you see, like, you know, the philosophers climb out, they go to the sun. The sun is bright, and people and the evil lies in the dark. You know, whiteness is that's white supremacy theory. You've got racism as part of the allegory of the case. White is superior, black is inferior. Then you've got the sun, which is out there with rationality. Who's rational? Men are rational, women are irrational. So men are superior to those, sexism as part of it. And then it's rationality, which humans possess rationality, animals do not possess rationality. So it's speciesism, discrimination against non-human animals. Then you've got the truth. That more in Aristotle, the truth makes us
the reception in Plotinus as well. Yes, yes,
and exactly, yeah. With teleology theory, so having the understanding, the eyes are there for seeing, the nose for smelling, and the genitals for reproduction. The only genitals are only used naturally if you use for reproductive purposes. You've got heteronormativity as part of that. You've got the violence which goes again along with truth claims, and this is part of the Judeo-Christian reception of the Aristotelian and Platonic thinking, and that's what really caused all the discriminatory or problematic, highly violent elements which go along with these two thinkers. Whether they meant it or not, I don't think that's even the relevant question in these contexts. Sorry, I had to.
No.
So Stefan, thank you so much for your very interesting talk. I think it's
here. You're speaking here.
Okay. So I will try to follow up on what Alessandro was saying about a possible progressive Nietzsche, but also on what Carlo was saying. It was really interesting to me when you said we do not have to overcome Nietzschean nihilism, but fully realize it. Given that you are also an authority in contemporary thought beyond your great expertise in Nietzsche studies, so I wanted you to expand a little bit more on what it means, in your view, to fully realize Nietzschean nihilism today.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. And I'm aware that there are lots of challenges which go along with it, but I do think sort of nihilism, both concerning truth as well as concerning values and norm, are actually a wonderful achievement as a consequence of being able to take that separate stance towards one's inside. So one of for example, you have a discussion with the Chinese. You approach, we come from the West, telling the Chinese, telling the people in Botswana with Ubuntu, we've got that human rights and they've got universal validity. And that is a very arrogant, that's a colonialist stance which goes along with truth, and the violence which is implicit in that notion of truth. So we tell the rest of the world what the true understanding is. The white, you're superior human beings telling the Chinese and the people of color in Botswana why Ubuntu is wrong and why the relational Chinese understanding is wrong, but we have the human rights which have universal permanent validity, essentialist validity. But once taking that stance, it's really like you look down as a colonialist, neo-colonial implications. And once you take into consideration, I think sort of human rights, they're great achievements which have gone along with it. But once you recognize It is a contingent nodal point. It is something which we've conceptualized. It is something we have created and which works really well in many circumstances. And we've successfully managed to reduce a lot of violence on that basis. But sort of by interacting with Ubuntu culture, then you take a stance and realize, well, they might be wrong and I might be they might be right and I might be wrong. So, and you recognize the importance. It shows a respect for the others, and the respect for the others opens up the dialogue with the others. And it's not that neo-colonial. We export our human rights, essentialist human rights understanding to all the rest of the world, which is stupid to grasp it. And so that is one of the practical implications which goes along with such a nihilist stance, which doesn't mean so human rights, you can still affirm them, but you can relativize them as something, we stick to them, even though they're fictions, even they're human-made fictions, as all of the values and norms are human-made fictions. And that is basically one of the consequences on the basis of such an ontology of permanent becoming. In the end, there's not the possibility of ontologically having some eternal unchanging values and norms which can be grasped by means of rational insights. In the end, we realize, well, yeah, it is a power place. There's power dynamics which Nietzsche and Foucault have taught us how to understand, to grasp, to analyze, and it needs to be taken into consideration. And whenever old power hierarchies are being criticized, there are new power hierarchies and tribes which need to be considered, and there's never without violence. It's always in the interest of one specific group which gets considered. But in the end, it is also the realization. So being able to take a separate stance. I love liberal democracies. I think that social liberal democracy is a wonderful achievement. But at the same time, are they a truth? No, they're not a truth. If in 100 years' time, or maybe 50 years, or maybe 500 years, we'll have a very well-developed intelligence, artificial intelligence, which can make better political decisions than us, then maybe we need to. I don't know whether that will come about, but then I'm open. Then suddenly liberal democracies are not the best answer. Then maybe we need to find a different structure, and you need to give up. So it is just sort of more humble understanding concerning one's own values and norms, which goes along with sort of that ethical nihilism, which I think sort of any attempt of overcoming nihilism, any attempt of re-embracing, of fighting for a new type of essentialist, really has it. I go around, I tell everyone what has always been valid, and that is where the violence comes from, and what needs to be avoided. So I do think, so I strongly support with Massimo and sort of. And with that, nihilism is actually something to embrace, something which needs to be promoted, but promoted sort of in a way of showing the advantages which go along with it, in promoting a less violent type of culture, not a type of culture which can avoid violence, but where like different power drives, different power constellations can be realized. So it's no longer, if we at the same time realize maybe that's no longer an anthropocentric society, because we no longer have a good justification that we receive it's us who receive the divine spark, and that's why we are ultimately superior than all the other animals. But we need to look at like which entities need to be taken into consideration, and it makes sense to say that all suffering entities need to be taken into consideration, because more suffering seems to be morally relevant capacity. And then the adult ape can suffer, whereas the fertilized human egg cannot suffer, because the fertilized human egg doesn't have a nervous system nor a sufficiently developed brain. Brain development starts only 3 weeks after fertilization. So that's why that moves us away from an anthropocentric conceptualizing to something which provides us with a reason, also taking non-human animals and the moral status of non-human animals more into consideration. And that seems to be a more plausible way of dealing with the challenges with which we're confronted today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ora, qualche altra domanda da parte anche E chi è a casa? Manuel? No? Sì.
Sì, grazie per il tuo intervento. Preferisci parlare in inglese, non c'è problema. Your question was very rich, and there were many topical points, so I cannot address all of them. Just a suggestion. If I understood correctly what you said about leisure, I think you said at some point that in order to gain access to a non-totalitarian understanding of the Gesamtkunstwerk, we should understand in a different way our relationship to leisure, right? So we have to consider leisure in a different way instead of addressing the topic again with dualism in mind between vita contemplativa and vita activa, right? But since you, the main author of your talk was Adorno, originally, at least.
I skipped some, I had some more section on Adorno, but I thought that's long enough, so.
Okay, well, you quoted him as well.
Yes, I did mention him at least, yeah.
There's also the problem, which Adorno addresses correctly, I think, about the fascism, so the totalitarianism in leisure. Because I just give you an example. When the students occupied the university, what did he do, the communist Adorno? He called the police, right? Because he was indeed a stark supporter of Hegel, naturally, but also the meaning of form, which in Hegel's aesthetics as the core, the topic, because form is the real way to understand resistance, and as well in the resistance to the political order as well, right? But if you refuse form in the name of some free thinking, undisciplined thinking, I just put it bluntly, you know, obviously there's another way of addressing this topic as well, but I just put it aside because I want to be brief and blunt. What do you think about that? Because free thinking goes on and on and on and on. Also the weak thinking, because there's also the despotism of the infinity of the dialogue, right? The Greeks understood the real tyranny in the infinite. When you have the metron, that's when you are free. So when you have a full stop to this infinite dialogue, so when you have a morphe, which you can address and contemplate, obviously. So these are my suggestions.
No, that's not a small point, so that's a big point. Adorno, Adorno has made some really interesting conceptions, also by reference to his sort of, it's interesting how he conceptualized extra musical meanings. He stressed the relevance of autonomy of works of art, and by upholding the relevance of autonomy in works of art, and so really autonomy by forcing to always go beyond and to avoid beauty, to avoid traditional harmonies, because thereby you affirm the traditional structures. They cannot be autonomous, they cannot be authentic to the artist conception. And thereby, but he also affirmed that thereby you can have an extra musical effect. So by having autonomy, you know, as a work of art, you show the ethical relevance of autonomy in that way. That's by stressing the elements, and now I'm sort of firstly criticizing one of the elements in Adorno, which so you always, you do assume, he does assume, one needs to reject all the dominant structures, musical, artistic structures, which have been there in the history of cultural creations. Any avant-garde work of art, in the ideal case, would have to be a creation, would have to represent a genre by itself. That would be the ideal case. In order to strip off all the heritage of what has culturally happened before in the cultural history. That has strong implications concerning the notion, even the ontological implications of what he had in mind as an authentic creation of an autonomous work of art. So he clearly had in mind, and that's what sort of artists in the 20th century, musicians in particular, did, like with 12-tone music, was moving away, really having to avoid any kind of consonance, because it has these totalitarian implications.
He was particularly considering the problem of conciliation.
Exactly.
After Auschwitz.
Exactly. And the thing is, and I don't think he's right with his notion of authenticity, because it means that there is not something. We share 50% of our genes with bananas. You know, we share more than 90%, 1998 with chimpanzees. There are, like, what we don't share, it makes up a couple of genes in us. So we have a lot more in common with each other than we do actually recognize. And as part of what we have in common, I would say it's also the structure, you know, what we see, what we identify with beautiful harmonies is something, you know, with sort of even the Platonic notion or Pythagorean Platonic understanding of like that we like eighths, octaves and fifths and fourths, we find them pleasing, is something which is widely shared. And so by drawing upon them, by using them, it doesn't mean one affirms totalitarian structures or one takes over something which is not authentic, but because it can be fully authentic, because it's part of our psychophysiological makeup. And that is sort of one of my main, I would have done that in a longer version, but it was already long enough. So that's why I sort of left out a bit more comments concerning Adorno. But that's one of the central criticisms. That's why these post-human aesthetics, post-human works of art, reflections on art, strongly move beyond the Frankfurt School aesthetics of the 20th century, because it says no, you don't have. If you like class or minimal music or jazz, that's not elevator music. That's not music created, or it doesn't have to be elevator music. It doesn't have to be music created in the interest of the cultural industry. It can be something completely authentic because it's part of a psychophysiological makeup. And so here we have, so that is probably sort of my most central criticism of Adorno, and actually by forcing everyone to avoid these harmonies, for example, notions of beauty. That's a new type of fascism. That's a new type of totalitarianism. You have a very strong universalist, essentialist implication of what needs to be avoided, even though it actually corresponds to the psychophysiological makeup of all our tribes. And that's why there's no good reason anymore to avoid these structures, beautiful structures in works of art. We can affirm them again. And we can affirm them again just like we can affirm total works of art, but we need to make sure that they're non-totalitarian, that they don't have these paternalistic, violent, and totalitarian implications. And so the criticism here of Adorno is exactly that it still remains totalitarian in basically the aesthetic disallowance, forbidding the use of beautiful harmonies as being totalitarian, because they are completely, we can be authentic artists which create that type of music because it's in our brain makeup, in our genetic makeup. It corresponds to our authenticity. It's not something alien to us which we take over from others. And that's why I think we can move beyond Adorno, and the post-human aesthetics doesn't have to be that radical critical one, that radical avant-garde one, which has been affirmed, which has been the dominant aesthetics in the 20th century, in particular when it comes to music and also the other arts. And that's why post-human art, post-human can be moved beyond and be much more playful, but not playful in the solely postmodern sense. And because the problem with the postmodern irony, on the other hand, is it sort of just turns into a new type of playfulness. You just play around with new forms for the sake of playing around with them, and that comes along with that. What he's doing, what other artists in the fields are doing. It's actually they're creating new forms. And Helbig and others, they are drawing upon. They sound very harmonious. Philip Glass, Diamond, which you know how Adorno would have reacted to that. You know? And what you do, they do so not out of the sake of just playfulness for something, but for the sake of a meaningful reflection on the world, of an engagement, not just to create new forms for the sake of creation, but it's a post-human seriousness of actually being engaged with the challenging issues concerning responsibility, concerning relevance, mindfulness, concerning implications on non-human animals. And so that's sort of the shift which is taking place. And the important thing is really the reaction in the end to Adorno, which claims that by composing like that, you are being totalitarian, you're being violent. And I'm saying, no, actually what you're doing is actually violent, because you forbid the use of something which is actually part of our genetic makeup. And so it's wrong. It's implausible to refer to that as being inauthentic. Am I making sense? Okay.
Va bene, grazie Stefan. Allora, se non ci sono altre domande, direi davvero di ringraziare Stefan anche per questa articolata, lunga discussione, nonostante il pubblico sia poco numeroso. No, vabbè, insomma, insomma, a merito dell'oratore aver parlato, insomma, con tanto anche, insomma, un tema così complesso, anche, insomma, la discussione è stata anche molto ricca, quindi il video poi, insomma, avrà, credo, il suo pubblico. E Carlo, possiamo finire qui o ci puoi intervenire tu?
Ma per me ringraziamo innanzitutto Stefan e ci rivedremo domani appunto per parlare di intelligenza artificiale, insomma lo diciamo, magari qualche studente può essere interessato.
Domani alle 12 sala seminari 2, secondo piano, Palazzo di Lettere, sì.
Dove ci sono gli studi di filosofia, ecco, insomma, per magari spieghiamo proprio chiaramente. Quindi noi ci rivedremo, noi Circolo Nietzsche intendo, ci rivedremo a marzo per sentire proprio te, Alessandro, se non sbaglio.
Esatto, sì. Sì.
Giusto?
Sì.
Bene.
Mi sembra 20 marzo, no? 20 marzo io parlo.
Sì, dovrebbe essere il 20 marzo, come oggi, sì, 20 marzo.
Sì. Parlo della ricezione di Nietzsche in Walter 18.
Nietzsche Redivivus.
Esatto.
Va bene.
Grazie.
A domani allora, a domani.
Sì, domani. Ciao.
Ciao.